Before the raids, before the trials, before the name Templar became a magnet for every rumor Europe could carry, there were books, not spell books, not forbidden gospels, ledgers. Across the continent, in fortified houses and quiet administrative rooms, the Knights Templar held deposits, debts, land records, royal funds, and promises written in ink. Then, in 1307, the doors were forced open. Assets were seized. Men were arrested. Documents vanished, scattered, or changed hands. And ever since, one question has refused to die. What did the Templars record that others wanted forgotten? To follow that question, we have to move slowly, not into fantasy, but into the stranger territory where ordinary paperwork becomes dangerous. A list of debts can frighten a king more than a sword. A sealed account book can outlive a battlefield, and a missing record can become more powerful than a surviving one. So tonight, we begin before the fall, before Friday the 13th hardened into legend. We begin in the years when the Templar houses of Europe were not simply religious outposts or military stations, but trusted places where money, memory, and obligation passed from hand to hand. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. The secret ledger may never have been one book, locked beneath one temple, waiting for discovery. That is the version legend prefers. The more unsettling possibility is quieter, that the ledger was a system, a continent-wide memory of who owed what, who trusted whom, and which powers were less independent than they wished to appear. Chapter 2. The Vow That Became a Banking System. The strangest thing about Templar wealth is that it grew out of a promise to own nothing. At first glance, this sounds like hypocrisy, almost too convenient. Men who swore poverty somehow became guardians of treasure. Warriors who called themselves servants of God became landlords, creditors, estate managers, and financial agents for people far richer than themselves. It is easy from a distance to treat that contradiction as proof of corruption. But medieval life was rarely that simple. A vow of poverty did not always mean that an institution was poor. It meant that the individual brother was not supposed to possess private wealth for his own comfort, vanity, or family advantage. His horse, his cloak, his weapons, his bed, even the food placed before him, belonged to the order. The man was meant to disappear into discipline. The organization, however, could receive land, collect rents, manage estates, and hold property for its mission. And that difference mattered. The Templars began as protectors of pilgrims traveling through dangerous territory in the eastern Mediterranean. Their public image rested on sacrifice. Armed monks guarding roads, defending Christian travelers, and standing at the edge of a world Europeans imagined as both holy and perilous. That image was powerful. It gave donors something emotionally clear to support. A noble family could give land to the order and believe that the gift strengthened the defense of sacred places. A widow could donate income from an estate and imagine prayers being said, roads being guarded, sins being eased. A ruler could grant privileges and feel that he was investing in both religion and war. The result was not a pile of treasure appearing overnight. It was slower, more durable, and far more useful. Fields, mills, vineyards, houses, rights, rents, livestock, and legal claims. Wealth in the Middle Ages often did not shine. It grew grain. It produced wool. It occupied boundaries. It came due every harvest season. This is where the order's poverty becomes almost paradoxical. A brother might sleep simply, eat plainly, and obey his superiors without personal property. Yet the house where he lived might administer a profitable estate. The stable might hold valuable horses. The chest might contain coins left in deposit. The writing table might hold documents that could decide who owned a vineyard, who owed a debt, or who had paid for passage across half a continent. To modern eyes, banking means institutions designed for finance. To the medieval world, it often began with trust. The Templars were useful because people believed they would still be there tomorrow. That sounds modest, but in a violent and fragmented Europe, reliability is a kind of technology. Local lords died. Roads changed hands. Coinage varied from region to region. Merchants could be robbed. Castles could be besieged. Families could feud for generations over a sealed agreement. A religious military order offered something unusual. It was international, disciplined, literate, and protected by prestige. Its houses were not isolated businesses, each depending only on a local owner's fortune. They belonged to a wider body. A Templar commandery in one region was connected, at least administratively and spiritually, to a larger organization stretching across kingdoms and toward the Crusader states. That connection made the order useful in ways a single monastery or local noble household could not always match. The Templars did not need to invent trust from nothing. They inherited it from their religious status and reinforced it through routine. They kept records. They maintained chains of command. They moved men and messages. They handled donations with an eye toward long-term administration. Their reputation was not built only on bravery in battle, but on the less glamorous discipline of not losing track of things. And in finance, not losing track is everything. A pilgrim preparing to travel did not simply need courage. He needed arrangements. He might have to sell property, convert assets into usable funds, secure supplies, repay debts, or make sure his family was not left exposed while he was gone. Carrying large amounts of coin was dangerous. Even small sums could attract thieves. Gold and silver were heavy, visible, and easy to steal. Written arrangements, by contrast, could move value in a quieter form. Here the Templars became practical. They could receive money in one place and provide support or credit elsewhere. They could acknowledge deposits, manage payments, and help turn a dangerous journey into something slightly more survivable. This was not banking in the modern sense, with glass towers and printed statements. It was personal, documentary, and deeply dependent on reputation. A seal mattered. A known house mattered. A clerk's entry mattered. The memory of the institution mattered. The same qualities that served pilgrims also attracted rulers. Kings and nobles had their own reasons to rely on the order. War required money before glory. Crusading required logistics before banners. Royal households needed cash, credit, safe storage, and trusted intermediaries. A king might command armies, but even kings had creditors. Even kings needed someone to move funds, guard valuables, and record obligations in a way others would accept. There is a quiet irony here. The Templars' military identity helped make them financially trustworthy, and their financial usefulness helped sustain their military identity. Donations funded horses, armor, ships, fortifications, and men. Victories and sacrifice encouraged more donations. More property required more administration. More administration created more expertise. Over time, the order became not only a sword arm of crusading Europe, but one of its trusted repositories of value. That did not mean every Templar was a financial genius. The order contained fighters, priests, servants, estate workers, administrators, and men who probably cared far more about horses than ledgers. But institutions develop habits. A house that collects rents for decades learns how to account for them. A network that receives donations across borders learns how to confirm them. A body that serves princes learns how to speak the language of obligation. The real transformation was not sudden corruption. It was accumulation. One gift required a record. One estate required management. One deposit required accountability. One loan required memory. Multiply that by years, by kingdoms, by wars, by pilgrimages, by royal emergencies, and a religious vow begins to cast an unexpected shadow. The order sworn against private wealth became an institution through which public, noble, and sacred wealth could circulate. This is why the mystery of the Templar ledger begins here, not with a hidden alphabet or a locked chamber. The unsettling question is not simply whether they had secret books. Of course they had records, and some records were naturally private. The deeper question is how much of medieval power passed through hands that were supposed to be empty. A poor knight could be trusted because he owned nothing for himself. The order could be trusted because it owned, managed, and remembered so much. That was the bargain. It was also the danger. For as long as the Templars seemed necessary, their wealth could be explained as service. Their estates were not greed. They were support for the holy mission. Their deposits were not hoarding. They were protection. Their records were not suspicious. They were administration. But usefulness has a way of changing its meaning when politics turns cold. The same discipline that once inspired confidence could later look like secrecy. The same network that moved money safely could appear too independent. The same poverty that made individual brothers seem pure could make the institution's wealth seem almost unnatural. A vow had become a system, and systems, especially those that remember debts, rarely remain innocent in the eyes of those who owe them. Chapter 3. Europe's Sacred Branch Network. To understand the financial power of the Templars, it helps to stop looking for a single room. The imagination wants one place. A vault beneath Paris. A sealed chamber under a chapel. A chest wrapped in iron, hidden behind a false wall, holding the one document that explains everything. It is a satisfying picture because it gives mystery a location. You can point to it. You can descend toward it. You can almost hear the key turning. But the real strength of the Templars was not concentrated like that. It was spread out. Across medieval Europe, the order held houses, farms, chapels, mills, vineyards, storehouses, pastures, urban properties, and fortified administrative centers. Some were grand enough to impress a noble visitor. Others were practical, almost plain, built to manage land, receive rents, shelter brothers, stable horses, and keep accounts. Together, these places formed something more important than a treasure chamber. They formed a network, and a network can be harder to see than a fortress. A fortress announces itself. It rises above the road and tells every passerby that power lives there. A network works differently. Its power lies in connection. One estate produces income. Another collects donations. A house near a port helps men and goods move toward the sea. A commandery inland stores grain, receives payments, or manages local agreements. A chapel gives the order spiritual legitimacy in the eyes of the community. A fortified compound offers security when roads are uncertain and politics grows unpleasant. No single place explains the whole machine. That is the point. The Templars' commanderies were not bank branches in the modern sense, and it would be misleading to imagine them as medieval versions of polished financial offices. They were religious houses, military support centers, estate headquarters, and local symbols of an international mission. Yet in practice, many of them performed functions that made finance possible. They gathered resources. They recorded obligations. They communicated with other houses. They helped turn scattered wealth into organized capacity. That last word matters: capacity. Money is not powerful only when it sits in a chest. It is powerful when it can be called upon, redirected, trusted, and counted. A ruler who knows funds are available in a secure place has more options than one who must drag metal across dangerous roads. A pilgrim who can deposit wealth before departure and receive assistance elsewhere has exchanged physical risk for institutional trust. A noble family that donates land to the order is not merely giving away soil. It is entering a relationship with a body that may continue to exist long after local alliances have shifted. This is where the Templar network begins to feel almost modern, although we should be careful with that word. Medieval finance did not operate with electronic balances or standardized systems. Communications were slow. Records could be lost. Local custom mattered. Personal reputation mattered even more. Still, the underlying idea is familiar. Value does not always have to travel in the same form as the person who owns it. Metal was heavy. Coinage was uneven. Roads were risky. But a written instruction, recognized by the right people inside a disciplined organization, could change what was possible. In that sense, the Templar houses acted like points on a map where trust could be stored. A man approaching one of these houses might not see anything that looked like a financial revolution. He might see a courtyard, a chapel, men at work, animals, carts, tools, perhaps armed brothers moving with the contained urgency of people trained to obey rather than explain. He might smell hay, iron, damp wool, wine casks, and the ordinary labor of an estate. The atmosphere was not necessarily mystical. It was administrative. And administration, when repeated across enough distance, becomes power. The Templars could receive income in one region and apply it to needs in another. They could use the revenues of European estates to support activities far away. They could draw upon donations, rents, and deposits not as isolated piles of wealth, but as parts of a wider body. This did not mean everything moved smoothly, or that the order possessed some flawless machine hidden beneath medieval chaos. But compared with many local institutions, the Templars had unusual reach. Reach changes the meaning of wealth. A village lord might be rich in land but trapped by geography. A merchant might be rich in goods but vulnerable to theft, shipwreck, or political closure. A monastery might be wealthy but rooted in one region. The Templars, by contrast, belonged to a religious military order whose identity crossed borders. Their houses gave them a presence in many places at once. That presence made them useful to pilgrims, nobles, kings, and church authorities who needed more than local strength. It also made them difficult to fully understand. People fear what they cannot map cleanly. A king could see a castle, A bishop could inspect a charter. A local creditor could demand payment from a neighbor. But a transnational order, moving value through documents, relationships, and distant houses, was something more elusive. Its assets were visible in pieces, but its full significance lived between those pieces. This is one reason the legend of hidden Templar treasure has lasted so long. A scattered system leaves behind scattered evidence. Later generations look at missing records, seized properties, abrupt transfers, and rumors of wealth, then try to assemble them into a single dramatic secret. The mind prefers a vault, because a vault is easier to imagine than paperwork passing through 100 hands. Yet the network is the more unsettling idea. A vault can be emptied. A network can remember. It can remember who made a donation and under what conditions. It can remember which rents were due, which debts were unsettled, which noble house had pledged what, which ruler had depended on credit, which lands supported which obligations. It can remember not as a person remembers, with emotion and embarrassment, but as institutions remember, through records, copies, seals, habits, and clerks who know where things are kept. That kind of memory does not need to be magical to be dangerous. The Templars' sacred character made this network acceptable. Their houses were not merely economic sites. They were tied to prayer, protection, and the imagined geography of salvation. A donation to the order was often more than a financial act. It was a spiritual gesture. Supporting the Templars allowed medieval Christians to participate, indirectly, in the defense of holy places. This helped convert local wealth into international purpose. But sacred purpose does not remove practical consequence. It may even protect it. Because the order was holy, people trusted it. Because people trusted it, they gave it resources. Because it received resources, it developed administrative skill. Because it developed administrative skill, more powerful people found it useful. And because powerful people found it useful, the order came to stand uncomfortably close to the machinery of political life. There is no need to imagine a secret empire behind every commandery. The evidence does not require that, and the story becomes weaker when fantasy does the work that history can already do. The more persuasive picture is of a religious order whose ordinary operations created extraordinary influence. Farms became revenue. Houses became nodes. Records became memory. Trust became infrastructure. That is a quieter form of power, but not a smaller one. When we picture medieval Europe, we often imagine fragmentation, borders, feuds, tolls, dialects, dangerous roads, rival lords, uncertain law. The Templars did not erase that world. They operated inside it. But their network allowed certain kinds of value to pass through the disorder with unusual protection. Not perfectly, not secretly in every case, but effectively enough that people noticed. And once people notice that an institution can move value without always moving metal, the institution begins to look different. It is no longer only a religious brotherhood. It is no longer only a military order. It becomes a map of confidence laid across a violent continent. That map may be the closest thing to the so-called secret ledger that ever existed. Not one hidden book, but a living arrangement of houses, obligations, seals, routes, and men trained to treat memory as duty. The treasure was not simply under the temple. It was between the temples. Chapter 4. The Pilgrim Who Carried No Gold. Imagine preparing for a journey where the road itself is a kind of enemy. Not every danger announces itself with a sword. Some arrive as a muddy bridge, a false guide, a sick horse, a corrupt toll collector, a rumor of bandits ahead, or a local coin that suddenly means less than it did 3 towns ago. Medieval travel was not romantic to the people who had to do it. It was slow, expensive, uncertain, and often frighteningly physical. Your money had weight, your food spoiled, your documents could be soaked through by rain, your body was your luggage rack, your passport, and your most fragile possession. For a pilgrim, the problem was even sharper. A journey to a holy place might be undertaken for devotion, penance, gratitude, grief, or hope. But holiness did not make the road safer. The pilgrim who carried coin carried temptation on his belt. A purse could be cut. A pack could be stolen. A traveler could be watched at an inn, followed outside the walls, and relieved of everything before dawn. Even when there was no violence, simple distance could consume money quickly. Lodging, food, animals, tolls, guides, repairs, offerings, and emergency payments all had to be considered. Gold sounds powerful until you have to sleep beside it. This is the practical world in which Templar finance made sense. The order did not need to begin with grand theories of banking. It began with a human problem. How does someone move through dangerous space without carrying all his wealth in a form that can be taken in a moment? One answer was trust written down. A traveler might deposit money or valuables with a Templar house before departure. In return, he could receive some form of written acknowledgement, instruction, or account arrangement that allowed him to draw support later from another house connected to the order. We should be careful not to imagine a sleek modern system with universal forms and instant verification. The medieval world was messier than that. Procedures could vary. Local circumstances mattered. The evidence does not support turning every Templar house into a fully standardized bank branch, but the basic principle was powerful. Value could be separated from metal. The pilgrim could carry less coin and more confidence. That confidence depended on recognition. A document alone was not enough if no one trusted the hand that wrote it, the seal that marked it, or the institution that stood behind it. A scrap of parchment from an unknown man could be ignored. A written order associated with the Templars carried a different weight because the order had reputation, presence, and discipline. Its houses were known. Its brothers were bound by rule. Its administrative habits made promises more durable than casual speech. This is one of the most important shifts in the story, and it is easy to miss because it looks so ordinary. The dramatic imagination wants secret symbols. It wants a hidden code that transforms a page into mystery. Yet for most people moving through medieval danger, the real wonder was not secrecy. It was reliability. A letter that could be believed was more useful than a cipher that could not be read. The pilgrim who carried no gold was not free from risk. He could still be robbed of clothes, papers, animals, and life itself. A document could still be lost or destroyed. A Templar house might be distant, understaffed, or unable to provide exactly what was expected. Travel remained travel. But reducing the amount of visible wealth changed the calculation. A bandit cannot easily steal what has already been deposited somewhere else. A corrupt official cannot seize coins that are not in the traveler's bag. A desperate innkeeper cannot overcharge a purse he cannot see. The genius of such arrangements lay in making wealth less visible. In a society where power often displayed itself through objects, rings, weapons, horses, robes, chests, seals, and coin, invisible value was unsettling. It required a different kind of imagination. The traveler with a thin document might be richer than the man with a heavy purse. The true asset was not the parchment itself, but the relationship it represented. That is why account systems matter. They are easy to overlook because they lack drama. A ledger does not charge on horseback. An entry in an account book does not look heroic in a painting. But a written account can preserve a claim across distance. It can say, in effect, that a transaction has already happened, that an obligation exists, that someone in one place should honor what was arranged in another. This changed what movement meant. Without such systems, travel forced wealth to remain close to the body. With them, wealth could be distributed across places and recalled through trust. A pilgrim could begin a journey with less fear of immediate ruin. A noble or official could arrange payments without physically escorting every coin. A religious order with many houses could turn geography into a service. Again, we should not exaggerate. The Templars were not alone in the broader medieval development of credit, deposit, and written financial practice. Merchants, Italian bankers, monasteries, royal treasuries, and other institutions all contributed to the growing sophistication of European finance. But the Templars occupied a distinctive position because they combined mobility, sacred reputation, military protection, and international reach. They were not merely people who could count. They were people others believed might be obeyed across borders. That belief was the engine. For the ordinary traveler, the experience may have been less glamorous than the legend suggests. Perhaps there was a conversation with an official of the house. Perhaps valuables were weighed, terms recorded, names written, witnesses noted, a seal impressed. Perhaps the pilgrim did not fully understand the administrative machinery behind the transaction. Most users of financial systems rarely do. What mattered was that the arrangement worked often enough to be worth trusting, and when it worked, it performed a small miracle of medieval practicality. The road remained dangerous, but the traveler became harder to ruin. There is something deeply human in this. The history of finance is often told as a story of greed, speculation, or power, and plenty of that belongs in the record. But here, at its root, we find anxiety. A person leaving home needed protection, not only for the soul, but for the purse, the family, the estate, the return journey. The written instrument was not abstract. It was a defense against fear. This helps explain why the Templar financial role expanded. Once an institution becomes trusted to protect value for vulnerable travelers, it becomes easier for more powerful clients to ask larger favors. If a house can safeguard a pilgrim's deposit, perhaps it can hold noble funds. If it can honor written instructions across distance, perhaps it can assist with royal payments. If it can account for scattered resources, perhaps it can help manage the flow of money that wars and crusades demand. Small, practical solutions can grow into systems before anyone admits what they have become. The pilgrim carrying no gold is therefore more than a picturesque figure. He is the clue to the whole transformation. He shows us why Templar banking was not simply the strange hobby of a wealthy religious order. It emerged from the pressure of movement in a dangerous world. Roads created risk. Risk created demand. Demand created trust. Trust created records. Records created power. And power, once written down, begins to cast a long shadow. The missing ledger, if we use that phrase carefully, was not born in a conspiracy. It was born when people needed a safer way to travel, pay, owe, and be remembered. The order's financial mystery begins with something almost modest. A traveler trying not to lose everything between one holy place and another. A purse could be stolen in an alley. A promise, if the right institution guarded it, could cross a continent. Chapter 5. The Paris Temple. In Paris, the Templar story stops feeling distant. It is one thing to imagine scattered commanderies across fields and roads, receiving rents, sheltering travelers, and keeping careful accounts. It is another to bring the eye into the capital of the French kingdom, where money and authority pressed close together, and where the order's financial power could be seen not as an abstract network, but as a guarded presence inside one of Europe's most important cities. The Paris Temple was not merely a religious house, it was a statement. Its walls enclosed a compound that carried several meanings at once. To the faithful, it belonged to a sacred military order. To travelers and clients, it offered security. To administrators, it was a place where documents, deposits, and obligations could be managed with unusual discipline. To rulers, it was useful precisely because it was not just another royal building. It had its own prestige, its own personnel, its own reputation for protection. That independence made it valuable. It also made it uncomfortable. A royal treasury inside, or closely tied to, a religious military house creates a strange political image. A king might command a kingdom, but his money could depend on people whose first loyalty was not simply to him. The Templars were not rebels in this arrangement. They were trusted servants of a larger Christian order. But trust has edges. When a ruler places valuables, records, or financial operations in another institution's hands, he admits something, even if no one says it aloud. Power needs custodians, and custodians remember. The Paris Temple stood near the machinery of monarchy, yet not fully inside it. That is what gives it its atmosphere. It was not a monastery withdrawn from worldly life, praying at a safe distance from ambition. Nor was it simply a fortress bristling for war. It was a disciplined enclosure where sacred identity and fiscal reality met. Men who had taken vows moved through a place where the concerns of princes could be reduced to entries, seals, receipts, and locked storage. The great misunderstanding is to imagine this as a contradiction that must be explained by secret corruption. It is more revealing to see it as a medieval solution to a medieval problem. Kings needed secure places. They needed skilled administrators. They needed trusted intermediaries in a world where political loyalty could shift quickly and physical wealth could be dangerously exposed. The Templars had buildings, guards, clerks, reputation, and a network beyond the city walls. In other words, they had what money requires before it can become power, protection, and memory. Paris magnified this. A rural estate could collect income. A porthouse could help move supplies. But the Paris Temple sat in a world of royal demands, legal pressure, diplomatic calculation, and debt. Here, the order's financial role was not hidden in the background of pilgrimage. It stood close to the crown. That closeness made the Templars useful to men who governed, taxed, borrowed, spent, and worried. A treasury is never just a room full of valuables. It is a nervous system. Inside it are stored not only coins, but plans. The ability to pay soldiers, the ability to fund journeys, the ability to settle obligations without public embarrassment, the ability to delay a crisis for one more season. A chest of silver may look silent, but it can decide whether a campaign moves, whether a marriage alliance is financed, whether a creditor is appeased, whether a king appears strong or exposed. This is why the Paris Temple matters so much to the legend of the secret ledger. It offers the imagination a perfect setting, a fortified religious compound, close to royal power, filled with records and money, later caught in the disaster of arrest and seizure. Everything about it invites suspicion. Yet the more careful reading is not less dramatic. It is simply more human. The danger was not that the Templars possessed one magical book. The danger was that they may have possessed ordinary records in a place where ordinary records could be politically explosive. A debt written down is less flexible than a debt politely forgotten. A deposit recorded under witness is harder to deny. A pattern of royal dependence, if preserved in accounts, can change how authority looks. Medieval kingship relied not only on law and force, but on image. A king was expected to appear as the giver, the judge, the protector, but financial records can show a different version of power. A ruler waiting on credit, managing shortages, negotiating with institutions he cannot simply ignore. There is nothing mystical in that. It is precisely why it matters. The Paris Temple must have carried a rhythm different from the battlefield reputation of the order. Instead of hooves and lances, there were visitors, clerks, messengers, sealed documents, counted coin, guarded rooms, and conversations that probably sounded dull to anyone who did not understand their consequences. Much of real power is boring when observed too closely. It becomes frightening only later, when we realize what the boredom controlled. One can imagine a nobleman entering not as a romantic crusader, but as someone with business to settle, a payment to confirm, a sum to retrieve, an obligation to arrange before departure. Perhaps a royal agent arrives with instructions. Perhaps a church official needs funds routed. Perhaps a clerk opens a book and finds the relevant entry not by mystery, but by habit. That habit is the point. Repeated trust turns a place into an institution. The Paris Temple became important because powerful people treated it as important, and because it performed its functions well enough that they kept returning. Its authority was not only imposed from above, it accumulated through use. Each transaction gave the next one a reason to happen there too. And yet, every layer of trust added another layer of risk. When the Templars were admired, the Paris Temple could be seen as a strong box for Christendom's work. When suspicion grew, the same strong box could be reimagined as a place of concealment. The walls did not change. The records did not need to change. The political weather changed, and suddenly administration began to look like secrecy. This is a pattern history repeats with unsettling regularity. Institutions are praised for discretion until someone wants what they hold. Then discretion becomes opacity. Independence becomes arrogance. Memory becomes threat. The Paris Temple stood at that dangerous crossing. Its role in royal and ecclesiastical finance made it more than a backdrop to later events. It helps explain why the downfall of the order could not be only a spiritual scandal, only a legal drama, or only a story of accusations. It was also a confrontation with an institution that had become woven into the financial life of power. To strike the Templars was not like attacking a remote monastery. It meant touching deposits, claims, records, privileges, and relationships that extended far beyond the men arrested. The old legends like to place treasure beneath the temple because treasure is easy to understand. But the more serious mystery lies in what the temple represented. It was a place where wealth became organized, where trust became paperwork, where rulers allowed outsiders to guard pieces of their strength. That is why Paris becomes the center of gravity. Not because every answer was hidden there, not because a single chamber contained the secret history of Europe, but because, in that compound, the Templar contradiction became visible. Holy poverty managing worldly wealth, military discipline serving financial trust, royal power leaning on an order it did not fully control. A monastery is supposed to remind a king of eternity. The Paris temple may have reminded him of his debts. Chapter 6. The Language of Trust. A medieval financial system did not survive because everyone could read secret signs. It survived because the right people could recognize the right signs. That distinction matters. When people hear the words Templar code, they often imagine hidden alphabets, symbols scratched into parchment, messages disguised so completely that only initiated brothers could unlock them. It is an attractive idea. It gives the order the atmosphere of a conspiracy. It turns every mark into a clue. But if we are looking for the practical heart of Templar finance, encryption may not be the first place to begin. Trust was older, stronger, and more useful. In the world the Templars inhabited, a seal could carry enormous authority. Wax pressed with a known design was not decoration. It was identity made visible. A sealed document said that a particular authority stood behind the words written there. Break the seal, and the document's integrity was damaged. Forge it, and you were not merely lying. You were attacking the structure that allowed distant people to act with confidence. A witness mattered for similar reasons. A name attached to a transaction could anchor memory in a human body. Someone had seen. Someone could confirm. Someone's reputation now stood beside the agreement. In a society where literacy was limited and law depended heavily on recognized persons, this was not a small detail. It was the bridge between ink and consequence. The Templars understood that bridge. Their financial power rested on more than locked chests. It depended on procedures that made people believe an instruction was real. Who wrote it? Who carried it? Which seal marked it? Which house received it? Which brother had authority to act on it? Which entry and which account matched the claim? These questions may sound dull compared with tales of hidden symbols, but they were the questions that determined whether money moved. And money, when it moved across medieval distance, needed reassurance at every step. Imagine a written order arriving at a Templar house far from the place where the original deposit had been made. The parchment is not magic. It cannot defend itself. It cannot explain its own history. It must be interpreted by people trained to know what is normal and what is suspicious. The hand may be familiar. The seal may match expectation. The wording may follow a recognized pattern. The messenger may be known or at least plausible. The account book may contain an entry that confirms the arrangement. Only when these elements agree does the document become powerful. This is a different kind of secrecy. Not the secrecy of an unreadable cipher, but the secrecy of controlled understanding. Outsiders might see a document and recognize that it concerned payment, debt, or custody, but they might not know whether it was valid, complete, altered, fulfilled, duplicated, or connected to another record elsewhere. The page could be visible and still not fully legible in the deeper sense. Financial systems often work that way. A banknote is not valuable because the paper is rare. A signature is not binding because ink has supernatural force. These things matter because institutions teach people how to trust them. The Templars operated in a world before modern banking law, but the principle was already alive. Authority had to be recognizable. Instructions had to be authenticated. Records had to agree with other records. Reputation had to do what technology could not yet do quickly. So when later writers become fascinated by a Templar cipher, we should pause. It is possible that Templars, like other medieval institutions involved in military and diplomatic affairs, sometimes needed private communication. Any organization handling movement, money, and conflict would have reasons to protect sensitive information. Routes, payments, political arrangements, and internal instructions were not things one would wish to broadcast casually. Caution would have been sensible. But caution is not the same as proof of a formal secret alphabet. The famous symbols often presented today as the Templar cipher belong more safely to later traditions unless tied to firm medieval evidence. Some versions appear in contexts shaped by Masonic, Neo-Templar, or antiquarian fascination, long after the original order had been dissolved. That does not make them meaningless. Legends have their own history, but it does mean we should not place them too confidently into the hands of 12th or 13th century Templar clerks. The temptation to do so is understandable. A cipher feels like a key. It promises that the whole mystery can be solved by learning the hidden alphabet. Decode the marks, and the Templars will speak. History is rarely so generous. The more convincing language of the order was probably administrative. Seals, titles, formulas, copies, receipts, inventories, acknowledgments, and account entries. This language did not need to be theatrical. It needed to work. It needed to survive travel, scrutiny, dispute, and delay. It needed to allow men who might never meet face to act as though they shared a room. That is an astonishing achievement. Consider how much pressure rested on a small piece of wax. A seal could allow a distant house to honor an order. It could protect a donor's intention. It could help distinguish a legitimate request from fraud. It could connect a local transaction to a wider institutional authority. In a fragmented world, the seal compressed reputation into a physical mark. But reputation itself remained the deeper seal. A Templar document mattered because people believed the order kept its own discipline. If the order's internal administration had been chaotic, its paperwork would have lost value. If its brothers were widely believed to steal deposits or ignore obligations, the seal would become decoration. Trust is never automatic. It must be performed repeatedly until it feels natural. That repeated performance may be the least glamorous and most important part of the story. The Templars did not become financial intermediaries only because they were feared or admired. They became useful because their promises could be checked against institutional memory. A payment recorded in one place could have consequences in another. A deposit was not merely handed to a man. It entered a structure. The individual brother mattered, but the order mattered more. This made the system resilient. It also made it obscure. An outsider could not easily know how much the Templars knew, or where the confirming records were kept, or which copies existed, or how many obligations were tied to a single transaction. The opacity did not require a code. It emerged naturally from scale. A disciplined network produces information that only the network can fully read. Here, the idea of a cipher becomes useful as a metaphor, but dangerous as a claim. The real code of Templar finance may have been procedural. It was knowing which seal counted, which witness mattered, Which phrase indicated authority? Which account needed to be checked? Which house could be trusted? And which messenger should not be questioned too loudly at the gate? These are not mysteries in the romantic sense. They are the working habits of an institution that has learned how to make trust portable. And portable trust was revolutionary enough. When later centuries imagined hidden alphabets, they were responding to something real, even if they chose the wrong symbol. The Templars did operate behind layers of discipline. They did possess records many outsiders could not interpret. They did connect money, movement, and authority in ways that looked mysterious once the order was destroyed and its paperwork became fragmentary. But the strongest secrets are not always written in code. Sometimes they are written plainly, sealed properly, witnessed carefully, entered in the right book, and understood only by those who know why one ordinary line of ink can unsettle a king. Chapter 7. The Myth of the Templar Cipher. The Templar cipher is one of those ideas that feels as if it must be true. It has the right shape, a secretive order, a violent suppression, missing records, strange symbols, later societies claiming hidden descent. The ingredients fit so neatly that the mind begins arranging them before the evidence has even entered the room. You have probably seen the cipher before, or something like it. Angular marks, simple geometric fragments, a coded alphabet said to belong to the Knights Templar. It appears in books, on websites, in puzzles, in decorative art, and in the long afterlife of Templar legend. It looks convincing because it looks old. It looks old because it is spare, severe, and slightly architectural, as if each letter had been broken off a chapel wall. That is part of its power. A symbol does not need to prove itself before it begins to persuade. It only needs to feel as though it belongs. But history asks for something less romantic and more difficult. Where does the evidence place this cipher? Who used it? In what document? Under what circumstances? Can we connect it securely to the medieval order before its destruction? Or are we looking at a later invention, dressed in Templar clothing, because the name gives every mystery a deeper echo? This is where the story becomes interesting, not because the legend collapses, but because it reveals how legends are built. The famous Templar cipher, as it is commonly presented today, is difficult to tie with confidence to the working practices of the 12th to early 14th century order. The safer interpretation is that much of this cipher tradition belongs to later worlds. Antiquarian curiosity, Masonic symbolism, Neo-Templar imagination, and the broader European habit of turning destroyed institutions into containers for hidden wisdom. That does not mean no Templar ever wrote privately. It does not mean the order had no sensitive communications. A military religious institution operating across borders, handling funds, routes, property, and political relationships, would have had every reason to protect certain messages. It would be strange if discretion had not mattered, but discretion can exist without the famous cipher. Medieval secrecy was often practical rather than theatrical. A message might be entrusted to a reliable carrier. A document might be sealed. Sensitive details might be omitted, summarized, or delivered orally. Some written material might use abbreviations, formulaic language, or internal references that made sense only to trained readers. A dangerous instruction might be protected less by an alphabet than by context. Who carried it, who received it, and whether the surrounding records confirmed it. This is less visually dramatic than a coded alphabet, it is also more believable. The appeal of the Templar cipher comes from a modern desire for a clean key. We want secrecy to be solvable. We want the mystery to behave like a locked door. Find the right symbol, turn it correctly, and the hidden chamber opens. But the Templar mystery does not behave like that. It is not a puzzle made for us. It is a damaged historical landscape, with surviving records, lost records, coerced testimonies, later fantasies, and political motives all lying across one another. A cipher promises clarity. The archive offers fragments. Later groups understood the emotional force of those fragments. After the medieval order was dissolved, the Templar name did not disappear. It detached from the original institution and began to drift. Over time, it could be claimed, reimagined, moralized, romanticized, and repurposed. For some, the Templars became martyrs. For others, guardians of forbidden knowledge. For others still, symbols of noble secrecy, Christian chivalry, hidden initiation, or lost continuity. A cipher fits perfectly into that afterlife. It turns loss into design. It says, the documents are not missing because history is violent and archives are fragile. They are missing because someone concealed the truth. The symbols are not late or uncertain. They are remnants of a hidden language. The silence after the order's fall is not simply silence. It is a code waiting for the worthy. This is seductive storytelling. It is also a trap. The real medieval Templars become harder to see when every later symbol is projected backward onto them. A 17th or 18th century fascination can be mistaken for a 13th century practice. A decorative alphabet can become evidence. A romantic association can harden into a claim. Before long, the original order is no longer a historical institution. It becomes a screen on which later centuries project their own hunger for secrecy. And those later centuries had plenty of hunger. The destruction of the Templars left behind exactly the kind of wound that myth loves. The arrests were sudden. The accusations were extreme. Confessions were shaped by pressure and torture. The order's property was seized. Its reputation was broken, then partially reconsidered, then endlessly debated. Records survived unevenly. The official story never felt emotionally complete. Where explanation feels incomplete, symbols rush in. The cipher gives viewers, writers, and secret societies something tangible to hold. It is easier to draw a mysterious alphabet than to explain medieval accountancy. It is easier to imagine a hidden code than to follow the slow movement of rents, deposits, papal revenues, and royal debts through scattered houses. It is easier to sell secrecy when secrecy has a shape. But this is exactly why the cipher deserves caution. A symbol can be historically meaningful without being historically authentic to the moment it claims. The Templar cipher may tell us less about the medieval brothers themselves and more about the people who later wanted the Templars to have possessed a secret language. That desire is not trivial. It shows how powerfully the order's downfall affected the imagination of Europe. It shows that the Templars became more than their records. They became a vessel for suspicion. The irony is that the proven story is already strange enough. We do not need to give the Templars an invented alphabet to make them mysterious. Their actual position was unsettling. A religious order sworn to poverty, holding wealth. A military brotherhood, running estates. Guardians of pilgrims serving kings, monks, clerks, and warriors bound into a network that could store memory across borders. If later people wanted to imagine a code, Perhaps it was because they sensed that ordinary language was not enough to describe what the order had become. The cipher, then, is useful when treated as a symptom. It shows us how the Templar legend changed after the Templars themselves were gone. It shows how secrecy can grow around an absence. It shows how later traditions can wrap themselves in medieval authority, borrowing the aura of persecution and lost knowledge to strengthen their own symbols. But it should not be allowed to replace the harder question. What did the Templars actually record? How were those records authenticated? Who had access to them? Which documents were seized, copied, lost, or absorbed by other institutions after the arrests? Which financial relationships became easier to obscure once the order no longer existed to speak for itself? Those questions do not produce a neat alphabet. They produce a more uncomfortable silence. The myth of the Templar cipher survives because it gives that silence a pattern. It suggests that the truth is still there, hidden in marks, waiting for translation. Yet the deeper historical problem may be that much of the truth was not encoded at all. It was written in ordinary accounts, ordinary receipts, ordinary obligations, and ordinary hands. The kinds of documents people destroy, transfer, neglect, or quietly reinterpret when power changes. The famous cipher may belong mostly to the Templars' afterlife. The real secrecy belonged to the living system that no outsider could fully read. Chapter 8. Accounts, Checks, and Invisible Money. The most unsettling Templar document was probably not covered in symbols. It may have looked almost disappointingly ordinary. A name, a sum, a place, a witness, a seal, a note that one house had received value, and another house might later answer for it. To a casual observer, it was not treasure. It was not even very interesting, just ink on prepared skin, handled by men who understood that the page was worth more than its appearance suggested. This is where the story leaves the romance of secret alphabets and moves into something colder. Invisible money. Not imaginary money, not fake money. Invisible in the sense that value no longer had to appear as a visible heap of metal. It could exist as a claim, an obligation, a balance known to the right people, a written order that made one person's deposit meaningful in another place. That may sound normal now. Modern life is built on invisible money. Salaries arrive as numbers. Debts live in databases. A person can cross a city carrying almost nothing and still command enormous value through cards, passwords, signatures, and institutional recognition. But in the medieval world, this idea had a sharper edge. Coin was physical. Land was physical. Wealth was supposed to have weight, boundaries, and witnesses. The Templars helped make wealth portable by making it documentary. We should be cautious with the word check, because the medieval instruments were not identical to the modern check sitting in a bank's legal framework. But check-like habits did exist. Written instructions, acknowledgments, and orders that allowed payments or transfers to be made without physically moving every coin alongside the person who owned it. The importance lies not in whether the word fits perfectly. The importance lies in the mental shift. A written instruction could act. It could move value from one relationship to another. It could settle a debt. It could reduce the need for dangerous transport. It could make a distant house answer for something arranged elsewhere. It could allow the order to become, in effect, a trusted interpreter between people, places, and obligations. This was not fantasy. It was administration. And administration can be more radical than it looks. Picture the difference between two travelers. One carries coins sewn into his clothing, hidden badly, because fear makes every movement awkward. He must guard his bag while sleeping, eating, praying, bargaining, even relieving himself on the roadside. His wealth is always with him, and therefore always exposed. The other carries a smaller purse and a document whose meaning depends on a network. A thief may steal the parchment and gain nothing if he cannot prove the identity, satisfy the conditions, or pass the scrutiny of the house that receives it. The document has value only inside a trusted system. Outside that system, it may be little more than an expensive scrap. That is the real cipher, not an alphabet, but a context. The page could be read aloud, and still not fully understood. An outsider might know the words. He might even recognize the amount, but he would not necessarily know whether the account had already been settled, whether a duplicate existed, whether the seal was correct, whether the bearer was legitimate, or how the entry fit into a larger chain of records. The system was legible to insiders because they knew how the pieces spoke to one another. This made Templar finance powerful in a way that was easy to underestimate. It did not merely guard wealth, it translated wealth. Coin became credit. Local deposits became distant access. Individual transactions became entries in an institutional memory. The order stood between the dangerous material world and a more abstract world of trust. Of course, abstraction creates suspicion. A chest full of coins can be opened and counted. A field can be walked. A flock can be seen. But a balance held across several houses is harder to grasp. A ruler or noble might know what he had borrowed or deposited, but not always how that obligation looked inside the order's wider books. A clerk might know that one sum connected to another. A treasurer might understand patterns invisible to the client himself. The financial instrument, then, did not just solve problems. It created a new kind of knowledge, and knowledge tends to gather around those who record it. This is why the Templar ledger, understood broadly, matters so much. An account book is not neutral in the way people imagine. It decides what counts, what is remembered, what is matched against what, and what can later be proven. It gives shape to reality. A debt that exists only in conversation can be denied, softened, reinterpreted. A debt written into a trusted account has a harder spine. That hardness could protect ordinary people. It could help pilgrims, donors, and clients know their arrangements had not evaporated. But it could also expose the powerful. Kings and lords often preferred memory to be flexible when flexibility served them. Written finance made certain dependencies less easy to disguise. The Templars were not the only ones developing these practices. Medieval Europe contained merchants, moneylenders, royal officials, Italian banking families, monastic administrators, and urban financiers whose innovations mattered deeply. The Templars belonged to a larger movement toward written credit and account-based power. Their distinctive role was not that they invented invisible money from nothing. It was that they made such practices feel secure within a sacred, military, international frame. That combination was unusual. A merchant might be clever, but vulnerable. A moneylender might be useful, but socially resented. A royal officer might be powerful, but tied to one crown. The Templars could present financial handling as service to a holy mission. Their wealth moved beneath the sign of sacrifice. Their records rested behind walls associated with discipline, prayer, and war. That made people trust them. It also made their financial memory harder to challenge while the order remained respected. The real unease begins when one asks who could interpret the full picture. A client might understand his own deposit. A local brother might know the accounts of his house. Senior officials might see connections across regions, but very few people could understand the whole machine. The network itself created levels of visibility. Every participant saw something. Almost no one saw everything. A system like that does not need theatrical secrecy to become mysterious. It becomes mysterious through specialization. The clerk knows the abbreviations. The treasurer knows the habits of payment. The commander knows which noble families are reliable and which are desperate. The messenger knows which routes are safe. The central house knows which local accounts matter. The outsider sees only fragments and calls them secrets. Sometimes he is not wrong. A secret is not always a hidden fact. Sometimes it is a fact surrounded by procedures you do not control. The Templars' written instruments helped create a world where value could travel more quietly than coin. That achievement deserves more attention than any supposed alphabet. It changed the meaning of distance. It turned trust into something that could be carried, checked, and honored. It allowed medieval finance to become less dependent on the visible movement of metal and more dependent on institutional belief. And belief, once attached to accounts, becomes a very serious thing. Because when people trust a document, the document begins to behave like money. When they trust a seal, the seal begins to behave like presence. When they trust a ledger, the ledger begins to behave like memory. The Templars' most powerful code may have been the one written in plain sight. A disciplined arrangement of records and obligations that outsiders could read line by line yet never completely understand. Chapter 9. Popes, Kings, and Debts in Transit. Pilgrims explain why the system mattered to ordinary fear. Kings and popes explain why it became dangerous. A man on the road needed safety for his purse. A ruler needed safety for something larger. Revenue, obligation, reputation, and the ability to make promises across distance. Medieval power did not operate from one tidy center. It stretched across estates, ports, dioceses, courts, armies, and disputed borders. Money had to be gathered from one region, owed in another, pledged in a third, and spent somewhere far away under pressure. This was the world in which the Templars became more than guardians of travelers. They became useful to the machinery of international power. For the papacy, the problem was scale. The church was spiritual, but it was also administrative. It received revenues, granted privileges, supported crusading efforts, negotiated with rulers, and moved resources through a Europe where every border could slow a payment and every road could endanger a courier. Papal money was not a single stream. It was a collection of claims, dues, offerings, taxes, promises, and emergency demands, often gathered far from where they were needed. The Templars, with houses spread across kingdoms and a reputation for disciplined handling, could help make that scattered world more manageable. Their network gave church authorities a way to think beyond local storage. Funds collected in one place could be accounted for within a broader system. Payments could be routed through trusted houses. Obligations connected to crusading could be handled by men whose identity was already tied to the defense of the Holy Land. The fit was not accidental. The order's religious purpose made its financial service feel less like commerce and more like an extension of sacred duty. But sacred duty still required arithmetic. A crusade could be preached in language of salvation, penitence, and holy obligation. Yet armies ate grain, Horses needed fodder, ships required payment, fortifications demanded labor, and diplomacy had expenses that did not vanish because the cause was blessed. Someone had to collect. Someone had to count. Someone had to hold funds long enough for them to become useful. The Templars stood in that difficult space between ideal and invoice. Kings had their own reasons to rely on them. A medieval king was not a modern state with an efficient tax office and central bank. Royal income could be irregular, politically contested, and tied to land, feudal dues, customs, loans, fines, and negotiations with subjects who did not always enjoy being squeezed. War made this worse. A campaign required money before victory could produce prestige. Soldiers and suppliers were rarely satisfied by promises of future glory. So rulers borrowed, pledged, delayed, and arranged. A Templar house could serve as a secure place for deposits. It could help settle accounts. It could hold funds temporarily, transfer value through written order, and act as an intermediary whose reputation made transactions easier to accept. In some cases, this meant the order was not just watching history from the edge of the road. It was helping finance the movement of kings, armies, and papal policy. That role changed the moral atmosphere around the Templars. When they protected pilgrims, their usefulness was easy to admire. When they handled elite finance, admiration became mixed with dependence. And dependence has a sour aftertaste, especially for powerful men. A king may thank an institution while he needs it. Later, he may resent the fact that he needed it at all. Debt is never only economic, it is psychological. To owe money is to live with another person's memory. To owe money to a disciplined international order is to live with an institutional memory that may be harder to charm, intimidate, or erase. The lender, the custodian, or the intermediary does not have to threaten anyone openly. The record itself does part of the work. It says, "This happened. This was promised. This remains unsettled." For popes and kings, that could be useful. It could also be uncomfortable. The Templars' financial service rested on trust, but trust did not mean equality. The order could be both servant and power broker. It could obey religious authority while still knowing things rulers would prefer to keep discreet. It could support royal operations while preserving records that showed how those operations had depended on outside handling. The closer the order came to elite finance, the more it became entangled in the private weakness of public men. This is where the scale of the story widens. The secret ledger, if we use that phrase as an image rather than a proven object, was not simply a record of coins deposited by anxious travelers. It was a map of dependency. It connected local houses to royal treasuries, crusading funds to papal instructions, noble debts to institutional accounts. Its real danger was not that it contained one shocking revelation. Its danger was cumulative. One debt can be explained. A pattern is harder to dismiss. A king depending repeatedly on outside credit looks less invincible. A ruler whose funds pass through another institution is still a ruler, but his power is shown to be conditional. A pope directing sacred finance through a military order reveals the practical side of spiritual authority. None of this is scandal by itself. It is how institutions function. But when politics turns hostile, ordinary dependence can be rewritten as vulnerability. And vulnerability invites attack. The Templars were not simply rich. Many institutions were rich. The problem was that their wealth was mobile, recorded, connected, and tied to people who mattered. Landed wealth could be resented, but it was visible. Financial knowledge was more slippery. It traveled in books, sealed orders, correspondences, and memories shared among administrators. It did not need to be paraded to be influential. The orders' houses made them present where power needed them. Their religious identity made them acceptable. Their military reputation made them secure. Their records made them useful. Together, these qualities allowed them to operate as part of a medieval financial infrastructure before such a thing had a clean name. That may be the most important point. The Templars were not modern bankers wearing crosses. They belonged fully to their time, with all its piety, violence, hierarchy, and uncertainty. But within that world, they helped make certain financial habits feel possible at scale. Deposit, transfer, custody, written obligation, and trusted settlement across distance. A coin could pass from hand to hand. A debt could pass through a network. And once debts began moving through networks, power itself became harder to locate. Was it in the king who commanded? In the pope who authorized? In the donor who funded? In the clerk who recorded? In the house that held the deposit? In the seal that made the instruction believable? The answer was not one place. That was precisely the problem. By serving popes and kings, the Templars became woven into the fabric of decisions larger than any pilgrim road. They helped move the resources of holy war, royal ambition, and ecclesiastical administration. Their records did not merely count wealth. They preserved the roots by which authority borrowed strength from others. For a long time, that made them indispensable. Later, it would make them exposed. Chapter 10. The Order That Knew Too Much. There is a particular danger in being trusted by everyone. At first, trust looks like protection. People bring you their money because they believe you will guard it. They bring you documents because they believe you will not lose them. They bring you private arrangements because your reputation makes those arrangements safer than memory alone. But over time, trust collects residue. A deposit is never just a deposit. It tells you who had wealth available, who feared travel, who needed discretion. A debt is never just a number. It tells you who was short of money, who had bargaining power, who could be pressured, who was pretending to be stronger than he was. A transfer of funds reveals movement. A delayed repayment reveals strain. A royal reliance on outside custody reveals a kingdom that was less self-contained than its ceremonies suggested. The Templars did not need to spy to become dangerous. They only needed to keep records. That is the colder side of their financial power. The Order's knowledge was not necessarily gathered through intrigue or midnight meetings. Much of it came through perfectly ordinary administration. Someone brought money. Someone recorded it. Someone owed a sum. Someone acknowledged it. Someone requested payment elsewhere. Someone sealed the instruction. Someone preserved the account. Yet when enough ordinary records accumulate around powerful people, the result is no longer ordinary. It becomes a second portrait of authority. Public power has always preferred flattering images. Kings appear crowned, armored, anointed, enthroned. Bishops appear robed and certain. Nobles appear ancient, landed, secure. But financial records are not interested in dignity. They show dependency with a dry hand. They remember the loan behind the campaign, the deposit behind the journey, the obligation behind the alliance. That kind of knowledge does not shout. It waits. For much of the Order's history, This waiting knowledge could be understood as useful. The Templars were part of the great machinery of crusading Christendom. Their houses supported movement, money, and memory across difficult distances. Their financial services helped pilgrims, rulers, and church officials solve practical problems in a dangerous world. But institutions are judged differently when their original purpose begins to lose force. A military order at war can explain its wealth. Horses must be kept, men must be armed, fortresses must be supplied, ships must be paid for, losses must be replaced. In that setting, money looks like fuel for a sacred campaign. But when the military horizon darkens, wealth becomes harder to defend. The same estates that once seemed necessary begin to look excessive. The same guarded houses begin to look proud. The same financial skill that once served holy war begins to resemble an independent power without an obvious battlefield. This is not proof that the Templars had become corrupt in some simple sense. It is proof that their position had become politically fragile. They knew too much, held too much, and depended on an explanation that history was beginning to weaken. A king can tolerate a powerful institution when that institution solves a problem he cannot solve alone. He can even praise it. He can borrow from it, store money with it, consult it, and publicly honor it. But if the balance changes, gratitude can curdle. The helper becomes a reminder of dependence. The creditor becomes an embarrassment. The keeper of records becomes a threat. And there is no threat quite like a quiet archive. The Templars' records may have contained nothing scandalous in the dramatic sense. No grand confession. No single page capable of toppling a throne. The evidence does not require such a thing. The more plausible danger was cumulative. Layers of financial knowledge about noble houses, royal needs, papal revenues, debts in transit, deposits made under pressure, and obligations that powerful men might prefer to renegotiate in the fog. A system that remembers clearly can become intolerable to people who survive by controlling the story. This is why the phrase secret ledger should be handled with care. It may not have been one forbidden book. It may not have been hidden under a floor, wrapped in cloth, guarded by a brother who knew he was holding Europe's most dangerous object. That version belongs to legend because legend likes a prop. The real ledger may have been dispersed across rooms, houses, habits, copies, and trained memory. Its secrecy lay not in being invisible, but in being inaccessible. Outsiders could not easily see the whole pattern. Even insiders may have seen only parts of it. The full weight of the order's financial knowledge existed in the connections. And connections are difficult to seize cleanly. You can confiscate a chest. You can occupy a house. You can arrest a treasurer. But can you instantly understand the relationships behind the entries? Can you know which debt matters, which seal confirms what, which noble has already paid, which king has delayed, which account has a duplicate elsewhere? Can you distinguish routine administration from politically sensitive memory? To take the records of a network is not the same as understanding the network. That uncertainty may be one reason the mystery endured. Once the Templars were accused, arrested, and dismantled, their paperwork became vulnerable to interpretation by others. Some documents survived. Others disappeared into new hands. Some were absorbed into different institutions. Some may have been destroyed, neglected, or stripped of context. The financial memory of the order did not pass into the future as a clean, complete archive. It broke, and broken archives are fertile ground for suspicion. People later looked back and saw a wealthy order destroyed by a debt-ridden king, or at least by a monarch under severe financial and political pressure. They saw accusations that seemed extreme. They saw coerced confessions. They saw property seized. They saw a religious military order that had once guarded pilgrims become an object of fear inside Christian Europe itself. Then they asked the question that keeps returning in different forms. What did they know? The answer may be less theatrical than the legend, but more revealing. They knew how wealth moved. They knew who trusted them. They knew which powers relied on them. They knew the private underside of public authority. And perhaps most importantly, they knew it in writing. In medieval politics, that was enough to matter. The order's danger was not only its wealth, but its memory of wealth belonging to others. Its houses were not merely places where money sat. They were places where relationships were made durable. The Templars became custodians not just of coin, but of dependency. That is a difficult role to survive, because when an institution keeps other people's secrets, it is safe only as long as those people still want their secrets kept by that institution. Once trust fails, the keeper becomes the problem. The archive becomes evidence. The locked chest becomes accusation. The disciplined silence becomes suspicious, even if it was once the very quality people paid for. The Templars knew too much because Europe had asked them to remember too much, and memory, in the hands of an order no longer fully protected by its mission, could begin to look like power waiting behind a sealed door. Chapter 11. After Acre, before the fall. When Acre fell in 1291, something in the Templar story changed that no ledger could easily repair. For nearly 2 centuries, the order's identity had been tied to the defense of the Crusader states. The Templars were not merely wealthy landholders with a military costume. Their wealth, their privileges, their discipline, and their aura all depended on a mission people could picture. Armed brothers standing at the edge of Christendom's dream of the Holy Land. Acre was not just another lost city. It was the last major Crusader stronghold in the Levant. Its fall did not dissolve crusading hope overnight, but it made the old explanation harder to sustain. The Templars still existed. Their estates still produced income. Their houses still held records. Their financial usefulness did not simply vanish. But the battlefield that had justified so much of their power had receded. That is a dangerous moment for any institution. As long as a mission feels urgent, wealth can be interpreted generously. A strongbox becomes preparation. A commandery becomes supply. A privilege becomes necessity. But when the mission becomes uncertain, delayed, or symbolic, the same wealth begins to attract a different kind of attention. People start to ask why the fields remain productive, why the houses remain guarded, why the accounts remain active, when the great military purpose seems wounded beyond repair. The Templars were not alone in facing this problem. The broader crusading movement had to explain failure, loss, and distance. But the order's financial profile made its situation sharper. It remained visible in Europe. It remained connected to money. It remained useful to rulers and church authorities. And because it remained useful, it could not easily retreat into sacred nostalgia. The result was imbalance. The Templars were still rich enough to be resented, still disciplined enough to seem closed, still international enough to feel difficult to control, but no longer protected by the same clear image of military necessity. Their swords had not disappeared. Their vows had not been revoked. Yet the emotional argument for their privileges had weakened. This is where reputation becomes unstable. A generation earlier, a guarded Templar house might evoke sacrifice far away. After Acre, it could begin to evoke accumulation at home. The same administrative order that had once impressed donors could now look like self-preservation. The same financial services that once supported crusading could seem detached from crusade itself. The order still served functions, but function is not the same as inspiration. Power needs a story. Without a convincing story, it becomes property, and property can be seized, taxed, envied, or denounced. It would be too simple to say that the fall of Acre caused the fall of the Templars. History rarely works with one clean lever. Political pressure, royal debt, church politics, public suspicion, legal strategy, and the personality of rulers all mattered. But Acre changed the atmosphere in which those forces operated. It made the order easier to question. The Templars could still argue for a future crusade. Many people did. Plans for recovery did not disappear, but promises of future campaigns are weaker than the visible defense of actual walls. The further the Holy Land moved from daily reality, the more the Order's European assets seemed to stand on their own. And standing on their own, they looked enormous. This is one of the quiet tragedies of institutional survival. The Templars had been built for endurance. Their lands, records, and financial systems allowed them to survive shocks that would have ruined a looser brotherhood. Yet that same endurance became suspicious once the purpose behind it seemed damaged. A fragile order might have disappeared with the loss of Acre. A strong order remained, and therefore had to explain why it remained. The explanation was not impossible. The Templars still had religious identity, administrative duties, and possible military plans. They were still part of the crusading world. But perception does not wait patiently for nuance. In the eyes of critics, a wealthy order without a clear battlefield could be made to look like a body living off the memory of a lost cause. Financial records made that perception worse. A poor, broken military order might inspire pity. A wealthy, accounting, land-holding, credit-handling order inspired different feelings. Its books could continue even when its banners had failed. Its estates could keep yielding income even when the walls of Acre were gone. Its clerks could still write, count, seal, and remember. There is something almost unbearable about that contrast. The Holy Land was lost, but the accounts remained. To supporters, this could mean readiness. The order was preserving resources for the next effort. To enemies, it could mean hypocrisy. The order had become a financial institution, wearing the memory of war like a cloak. Both interpretations could use the same facts and reach different emotional conclusions. That is how suspicion grows, not from new evidence alone, but from a change in mood. After Acre, the Templars were trapped between past glory and future uncertainty. They had to defend not only their conduct, but their relevance. And relevance is a fragile currency. Once people begin to doubt it, even honest administration can look like concealment. This matters for the secret ledger because the period after Acre likely intensified the importance of what the order knew and held. With military prestige weakened, financial knowledge stood out more starkly. Deposits, debts, transfers, rents, and obligations became harder to hide behind the romance of holy war. The ledger, in its broader sense, was no longer merely the bookkeeping of a crusading order. It was the memory of a wealthy institution whose original mission had suffered a devastating blow. That made it vulnerable to reinterpretation. A ruler who had once needed the Templars could now ask whether they were still necessary. A debtor could ask whether their power had become excessive. A critic could suggest that their secrecy concealed corruption. A frightened public could be made to wonder whether defeat abroad revealed impurity at home. None of these suspicions had to be fair to be useful. The collapse of confidence often begins before the formal accusation. Long before the arrests, the order's position had become easier to attack because the old moral shield had thinned. The Templars still had resources, but resources without unquestioned legitimacy are tempting. They still had records, but records without political protection are dangerous to possess. They still had discipline, but discipline without affection can look like arrogance. The order had survived the loss of Acre. That survival may have been part of the problem, because by remaining intact, wealthy, and administratively powerful after the great military disaster, the Templars became a question Europe could not easily put away. What were they now? Soldiers without a kingdom to defend, monks with too much property, bankers with swords, servants of the church, or an international body too useful to trust and too independent to ignore? The answer depended on who was asking. For those who owed them, resented them, feared them, or wanted what they held, the question itself became an opening. After Acre, the Templars were not yet doomed, but the ground beneath them had changed. Their wealth had become more visible than their mission. Their books had become more conspicuous than their battles. And in that narrowing space between usefulness and resentment, the fall began to feel possible. Chapter 12. Philip IV and the Locked Books. King Philip IV of France does not enter this story as a shadowy villain from a simple tale. He enters as something more dangerous, a ruler under pressure. Philip was a king with ambition, enemies, legal imagination, and severe financial needs. He wanted a monarchy that could command more than ceremony. He wanted authority that could reach into institutions once thought difficult to touch. And again, money sat beneath the surface of his conflicts like a buried wire. A king may wear a crown in public, but in private he still has bills. Wars had to be funded. Officials had to be paid. Political pressure had to be managed. Royal dignity had to be maintained, even when the treasury did not cooperate. Philip's reign was marked by hard struggles over money and authority, including clashes with wealthy groups and with the papacy itself. He was not a man likely to look kindly on an independent international order holding property, records, and financial relationships inside his kingdom. The Templars were useful to kings. That did not make them safe from kings. By the early 1300s, the order stood in a strange position. It was still prestigious, still wealthy, still connected across borders, but its military mission had lost the clarity it once possessed. Its houses remained visible. Its financial role remained real. Its records, wherever they were kept, and however complete they may have been, represented memory that did not belong to the crown. For a ruler like Philip, that mattered. A locked book can offend power even before anyone opens it, not because it necessarily contains treason, not because it hides a single devastating sentence, but because it represents a boundary. It says there are things the king does not fully see, obligations he does not fully control, relationships inside his realm that answer to a wider authority. The Paris Temple made this boundary especially vivid. Close to the heart of a French power stood a Templar stronghold associated with money, custody, and documentation. It was not some distant rumor in the mountains. It was near enough to be useful, and therefore near enough to become intolerable. Philip's problem with the Templars cannot be reduced only to debt, though debt matters in the atmosphere of the story. Nor should we claim that the king attacked them solely to erase financial records. The evidence does not allow that kind of neat certainty. The charges brought against the order were religious and moral in form. The legal process that followed involved accusations of heresy, denial of Christ, obscene rites, and other claims that shocked Christian society. But political and financial motives can travel beneath religious language. This is one of the oldest habits of power. An institution may be attacked for its soul while its property is quietly counted. A legal accusation may speak of purity while clerks inventory estates. A campaign of moral outrage may also solve a fiscal problem. None of this means every accusation was invented in the same way, or that every participant understood the same motive. It means the collapse of the Templars happened where fear, belief, ambition, and money overlapped. Philip understood the force of law when law could be keyed to serve authority. He had skilled advisors. He knew how to frame conflict in terms larger than personal interest. A king who simply seized wealth might look greedy. A king who moved against heresy could present himself as defender of the faith. The difference was not cosmetic. In medieval Europe, spiritual accusation could transform a political attack into a sacred duty. That transformation placed the Templar records in a new light. Before accusation, ledgers were administrative. After accusation, they could become suspicious. A sealed account book was no longer just proof of discipline. It might be imagined as a container of hidden corruption, or as evidence waiting to be interpreted by hostile hands. The order's privacy, once a feature of trust, could be described as concealment. This is why the idea of locked books is so powerful. We do not need to imagine Philip trembling before a single secret ledger. It is enough to picture a ruler facing an institution whose records could reveal dependency. Loans, deposits, transfers, royal reliance, delays, arrangements, perhaps even embarrassing patterns of need. A monarchy seeks to appear sovereign. Financial records often show sovereignty being negotiated. That is not treason. It is worse, in a way. It is ordinary reality. And ordinary reality is sometimes what power most wants hidden. If the Templars held records involving royal finance, those records could have shown not scandal in the theatrical sense, but vulnerability. They could have shown that a king depended on systems outside himself. They could have preserved the memory of obligations that political convenience might prefer to soften. They could have placed royal dignity beside arithmetic, and arithmetic is rarely impressed by crowns. Still, caution is essential. No complete secret Templar ledger has survived to prove a master narrative of Philip's motives. We cannot open one book and find the hidden reason for the fall. The surviving record is partial, damaged by the violence of the trials, and complicated by later interpretation. It is tempting to make the financial explanation do all the work because it feels more rational than the strange accusations of ritual crime and heresy. But history can hold several motives at once. Philip may have believed some accusations, exploited others, and found in the order's destruction a way to strengthen royal authority. His advisors may have seen legal opportunity. His treasury may have seen relief. His political imagination may have seen a chance to bring a powerful international body under control. The public may have heard charges that confirmed older suspicions about secrecy, wealth, and closed brotherhoods. The locked books, then, symbolize more than paperwork. They represent the part of the Templar system Philip could not comfortably leave untouched. So long as the Order's records remained in its own hands, its memory remained its own. So long as its houses answered to a structure beyond the French crown, its wealth was not fully available. So long as its reputation held, its financial relationships could not be easily rewritten. To break the Templars, Philip had to do more than accuse men. He had to seize the context that made their records meaningful. This is the quiet violence behind administrative takeover. When authorities enter a house, they do not merely take objects. They interrupt routines. They remove custodians. They separate documents from the people trained to interpret them. They turn living records into evidence, property, or debris. A ledger without its institutional world is still valuable, but it is wounded. Its meanings become easier for others to control. That may be why the financial mystery survived so stubbornly. The records were not simply lost or preserved. They were displaced. Some may have been seized. Some may have passed through official hands. Some may have vanished because no one outside the Order understood their importance. Some may have survived only as fragments stripped of the relationships that made them dangerous. Philip's attack did not just open the books. It changed who was allowed to read them. And once that happened, later generations could no longer tell exactly what had been revealed, what had been hidden, what had been destroyed, and what had only been misunderstood. The absence itself became a kind of witness. In the end, Philip IV's role in the story is not that of a man frightened by a magic code. He was a ruler confronting an institution whose wealth, independence, and memory had become politically inconvenient. The Templars had spent generations turning trust into records. Philip understood that records, once captured, could become weapons, or could be made to disappear into the machinery of the state. A sword can defend a road. A locked book can defend a memory. And for a king determined to master his kingdom, memory outside his control may have been the most dangerous fortress of all. Chapter 13, Friday the 13th. The morning of October 13th, 1307, did not begin as legend. It began as an operation. Orders had been prepared. Instructions had been sealed. Men acting in the name of the French crown moved against Templar houses across the kingdom. The surprise was part of the weapon. If the arrests were to work, they had to happen before warning could travel, before records could be hidden, before brothers could flee, before allies could ask too many questions. That date would later become almost theatrical. Friday the 13th, a phrase now heavy with superstition. But for the men who heard boots in the yard, or voices at the gate, or the demand to open in the king's name, the terror was not symbolic. It was immediate. A religious military order that had once guarded pilgrims was now treated as a danger inside Christian Europe. The charges were grave. The Templars were accused of heresy, blasphemy, obscene initiation practices, and other offenses meant to horrify the faithful. These accusations gave the arrests a sacred vocabulary. The crown was not merely taking men into custody. It was claiming to defend Christendom from corruption hidden in its own armor. But beneath the religious language, another drama was unfolding. Property was being seized. Chests were being opened. Documents were being gathered. Houses that had functioned as centers of custody, credit, and memory were suddenly placed under hostile control. The same records that had once made the Templars trustworthy now became objects of official interest. This is the moment when administration turns into evidence. A ledger on October 12th might be a working book. A ledger on October 13th might be a clue, a liability, a weapon, or a prize. Its meaning changed because power entered the room. The ink did not need to alter. The political situation altered around it. Imagine the confusion inside a Templar house as royal agents arrived. Some brothers may have understood immediately that the accusations were catastrophic. Others may have expected inquiry, not destruction. A few might have believed their innocence would protect them. Institutions often believe their own usefulness will save them, right up until the door is forced. What mattered to the crown was speed. Speed prevents coordination. It prevents the order from becoming a network in defense of itself. The same connected structure that had moved money, messages, and trust across distance could become dangerous if given time to react. A single arrest might fail. A coordinated strike could paralyze. That is why the raid feels less like a spontaneous religious awakening and more like a political act planned with administrative care. Philip IV did not simply denounce the Templars from afar. His government moved to control bodies, buildings, property, and papers. It was a seizure of people, but also of context. Once the brothers were removed from their houses, the records remained, yet their interpreters were under arrest. A book without its keeper is vulnerable. It can be misunderstood, rearranged, selectively used, or treated as suspicious simply because the men who made it have been condemned. Here, the financial mystery becomes almost impossible to separate from the legal one. The Crown did not need to prove that every Templar record contained damaging secrets. The act of seizure itself transformed the archive into a field of possibility. What had they been holding? Who owed them? What had been deposited? Which royal arrangements sat inside their accounts? Which documents, if any, embarrassed men who now had power over the investigation? We cannot answer all of this cleanly. That uncertainty is important. No complete master ledger emerges from the morning of the arrests, neatly explaining motive, debt, and conspiracy. History does not hand us so convenient an object. What survives is messier. Accusations, proceedings, fragments, later references, institutional transfers, and the uncomfortable fact that the order's wealth and records became vulnerable at the same moment its reputation was being publicly destroyed. That pairing is hard to ignore. Religious accusation made the seizure morally possible. Financial seizure made the accusation materially consequential. One justified the other. If the Templars were heretics, their property could be treated differently. If their property and records were valuable, the charges became useful in more than one way. This does not require us to say the whole affair was only about money. That would be too narrow. Fear, belief, ambition, resentment, legal theory, and royal authority all had roles to play. But money was not incidental. The Templars were not a poor group of obscure monks accused in a remote village. They were an international order with land, buildings, administrative experience, and a financial memory reaching into elite life. To strike them was to touch a system, and systems do not fall quietly. The arrests produced a kind of shock that later generations struggled to process. How could an order so honored become so suspect? How could defenders of the Holy Land be accused of betraying the faith? How could men once trusted with deposits and royal funds be treated as enemies of Christian society? When a reversal is that violent, Rumor becomes almost inevitable. People search for hidden causes because the visible cause feels too strange. They imagine secret ledgers, buried treasure, coded confessions, vanished wagons, underground routes. Some of these stories are late. Some are embroidered. Some reveal more about later fascination than medieval reality. Yet they grew from a genuine rupture. The fall of the Templars really did involve money, power, documents, and sudden silence. The legend did not come from nowhere. On that Friday, the Order's records crossed a threshold. They stopped belonging simply to a functioning institution and became materials in a struggle over meaning. A royal officer might see assets. An inquisitor might see evidence. A debtor might see opportunity. A later storyteller might see proof of a hidden world. The same parchment could serve all these imaginations. This is why October 13th remains such a powerful date, not because superstition explains it, but because it marks the instant when a trusted network was recast as a threat. The Templars' discipline became secrecy. Their wealth became suspicion. Their private rituals, whatever their true nature, became monstrous in official language. Their records became dangerous by association, and their silence was no longer voluntary. Once arrested, the brothers could not defend the order in the ordinary way. They could not calmly explain every account, every transfer, every sealed instruction. They were isolated, interrogated, pressured, and in many cases, tortured. The institution that had depended on controlled communication was thrown into a process designed to break voices apart. The raid did not merely begin a trial. It broke the Order's ability to narrate itself. That may be the deepest wound of Friday the 13th. After the doors opened and the crown entered, the Templars were no longer the primary authors of their own record. Their enemies, judges, interrogators, and inheritors began writing the story around them. Some documents survived. Some property was redirected. Some financial memories were absorbed elsewhere. But the living network that gave those records their full meaning had been struck at the center. A ledger can survive a raid. A system of trust may not. And so the morning of October 13th, 1307, became more than an arrest. It became the point where finance, faith, and royal ambition collided so violently that even ordinary paperwork began to look haunted. Chapter 14: Torture, Confession, and Paper Trails. After the arrests, the story enters its most difficult territory. Not because the evidence disappears, but because the evidence begins to speak in a damaged voice. The trials of the Templars produced words. Many words. Confessions, denials, depositions, accusations, summaries, letters, and official proceedings. At first glance, this might seem helpful. A historian wants documents. A mystery wants paper. And here, suddenly, there is paper everywhere. But paper made under terror does not behave like ordinary paper. A confession extracted under torture is not the same thing as memory. It may contain fragments of truth, rumor, misunderstanding, fear, obedience, invention, or whatever the prisoner believed would end the pain. Some brothers admitted shocking charges, then later withdrew them. Others denied wrongdoing. Some spoke under pressure from royal officials. Others faced church investigators. The record is not silent, but neither is it clean. This is where the Templar mystery becomes morally uncomfortable. It is easy to treat the trials as a puzzle box, searching each statement for hidden clues. But behind every line stands a human being in custody, often frightened, isolated, and aware that survival might depend less on truth than on satisfying the men asking questions. The page may look calm now. At the time, it was produced inside a machinery of fear. That matters for the financial question. If the crown wanted the order's property, records, and authority broken, confession helped make that possible. Religious guilt could justify seizure. Public horror could weaken sympathy. Administrative takeover could proceed, while the accused struggled merely to survive the accusation. The ledgers, accounts, and stored documents did not have to prove heresy. They only had to fall into new hands, while the order's reputation collapsed. The Chinon material complicates the picture in an important way. It suggests that the highest authorities were not always dealing with a simple case of proven, monstrous corruption. There were inquiries, distinctions, absolutions, and legal tensions beneath the public drama. The Church's handling of the case was not identical to Philip's political urgency. That does not make the Templars innocent of every fault, nor does it solve the mystery. It shows something more interesting. Even at the center of power, the evidence was difficult to contain. Documents can clarify. They can also reveal confusion. The paper trail tells us that the order was investigated, pressured, condemned, and ultimately dissolved. It tells us that accusations were recorded and repeated. It tells us that some leaders confessed to certain charges under conditions we cannot treat as neutral. It tells us that the case moved through royal and ecclesiastical systems that did not always share the same interests. What it does not give us is a complete financial autopsy. We do not receive one perfect inventory of every Templar record seized in 1307, cross-checked against every debt, deposit, royal obligation, and transfer. We do not see the whole network laid open. Instead, we see the remains of a broken institution filtered through the hands of its judges, enemies, administrators, and inheritors. That is why the paper trail feels so frustrating. It is abundant enough to prevent pure fantasy, yet incomplete enough to keep the deeper question alive. The Templars were not destroyed in a dark room with no witnesses. They were destroyed through documents. Orders authorized arrests. Interrogations created records. Confessions became evidence. Papal actions produced correspondence. Properties required inventories and transfers. The collapse was bureaucratic as much as violent, and bureaucracy has its own kind of brutality. A sword kills the body. A document can kill the name. Once an accusation is entered into official language, it becomes harder to escape. Once a confession is copied, summarized, and circulated, it begins to outlive the conditions that produced it. A frightened sentence spoken in captivity can travel farther than the man who spoke it. It can become part of an archive, then part of a judgment, then part of a legend. The Templar records suffered a similar fate. Financial papers that once belonged to a functioning order were torn from the system that gave them meaning. A list of rents in its proper setting might have been routine. Under suspicion, it could look like proof of greed. A deposit record might once have testified to trust. After the arrests, it might invite questions about hidden wealth. A sealed instruction might once move value. Later, without context, it might simply deepen the aura of secrecy. This is how archives become haunted without any ghost at all. They are haunted by missing context. The Chinon material is useful because it reminds us that archival survival can change the story centuries later. A document misfiled, overlooked, damaged, or misunderstood, may re-enter history long after the people involved are dead. Suddenly, a case that seemed closed gains another layer. Not a total reversal, but a complication. The past does not change, yet our access to it does. That should make us humble. For every document that survives, others may have vanished. For every confession preserved, there may have been denials lost or ignored. For every account seized, there may have been companion records without which it cannot be fully understood. The absence is not proof of a conspiracy by itself, but neither is it meaningless. In a financial network, missing pieces matter because relationships are the evidence. A single account book can be misread. A connected archive can explain itself. The Templar archive, if we can even call it that, after the seizures and transfers, did not reach us whole. Its financial memory was interrupted at the moment of accusation. That interruption created room for later imagination. Secret treasures, vanished ledgers, coded alphabets, hidden survivals. Some of those stories go far beyond what the evidence can bear. Yet the emotional root of them is understandable. Something large was broken, and the surviving papers do not fully explain the sound it made. So the trials leave us in a fog, but not an empty one. We can see royal pressure. We can see religious accusation. We can see coerced speech. We can see administrative seizure. We can see the struggle between what documents claim and how those documents were produced. We can see that records were central to both the order's power and its destruction. What we cannot see is the complete ledger behind the curtain. Perhaps it never existed as one object. Perhaps the true ledger was scattered among many houses and many books. Perhaps some records were deliberately removed. Perhaps others were simply absorbed into new administrations and lost their Templar identity. Perhaps the most dangerous information was not dramatic enough for later storytellers to recognize. Debts settled quietly, dependencies erased by time, ordinary obligations that once mattered deeply to powerful men. The trials did not solve the mystery of Templar finance. They damaged the conditions under which it could have been solved. And that may be why the story still draws us in. The documents remain, but they do not restore the living system. The voices remain, but some were bent by pain. The paper trail remains, but it leads through rooms where power had already decided what it needed the truth to become. Chapter 15. What the secret ledger really was. By now, the secret ledger begins to look different, less like an object, more like an ecosystem. That may disappoint anyone hoping for a single forbidden book. Blackened leather, iron clasps, a symbol on the cover. The kind of thing that waits in a hidden chamber until a candle reveals its title. But the historical reality, if anything, is more unsettling because it is harder to destroy, harder to locate, and harder to explain in one sentence. The secret ledger was probably not one ledger. It was the financial memory of an order. It lived in account books, receipts, charters, inventories, sealed orders, acknowledgments, correspondence, copies, habits, and trained officials who knew how to connect one piece of paper to another. It lived in the commanderies that received rent, the houses that held deposits, the clerks who recognized formulas, the treasurers who understood balances, the messengers who carried instructions, and the clients who trusted that a promise made in one place might be honored somewhere else. That kind of ledger does not sit still. It breathes through procedure. The mistake is to imagine secrecy only as concealment. A thing is secret because it is hidden behind stone, buried under a floor, or written in a code no outsider can read. But institutions produce another kind of secrecy, the secrecy of complexity. A system may be partly visible and still remain unreadable to those outside it. You can see a house, you can see a seal, you can see a parchment. You may even show the amount written on the line, but you do not necessarily know what it means. Was the sum already repaid? Was it linked to another obligation? Was the borrower acting for himself, his lord, his king, or a wider political arrangement? Did the document represent cash, credit, land revenue, or a transfer balanced elsewhere? Was there a duplicate in another house? Did a seal confirm authority, or merely receipt? Which entry mattered most? The one in front of you, or the one held 200 miles away? The real power lay in the connections. This is why the financial memory of the Templars could become so potent. A scattered archive can tell a scattered story. But when the people who made the records understand the system behind them, the fragments become a map. Deposits connect to withdrawals, donations connect to estates, estates connect to income, income connects to military expenditure, papal needs, royal dependence, and private obligation. A line of ink in one place may only become meaningful when matched against another line somewhere else. To outsiders, that looks like secrecy. To insiders, it is bookkeeping. And bookkeeping is one of the most underrated forces in history. Armies win attention because they are loud. Treasuries matter because they are quiet. The Templars stood at the point where religious trust, military discipline, and administrative continuity turned scattered wealth into organized memory. Their records did not need to accuse anyone. They only needed to preserve what had happened. That preservation could serve justice. It could protect a donor's intention. It could keep a pilgrim's deposit from disappearing. It could prevent a noble from denying an obligation. It could allow money to move without every coin being dragged across a dangerous road. In that sense, the ledger was protective, but the same memory could become threatening. A ruler might prefer the past to remain negotiable. A debtor might prefer an obligation to fade. A government under pressure might prefer to control the evidence of its own dependency. The Templars' records, precisely because they were useful, may also have been inconvenient. They made certain relationships harder to pretend away. This is the heart of the mystery. Not that the Templars necessarily possessed some explosive secret capable of overturning Europe. Rather, they possessed a disciplined memory of ordinary realities that powerful people often dislike seeing preserved. Who owed, who paid, who delayed, who depended, who trusted, who transferred, who placed wealth outside his own direct control. There is no need to inflate this into fantasy. The grounded version is already sharp enough. A transnational religious order had become a keeper of financial relationships across medieval Europe. It had houses in many regions. It had prestige. It had procedures. It had access to the private machinery of power. Then, suddenly, it was accused, raided, interrogated, and dissolved. Its living system was broken. Its records were seized, scattered, repurposed, or stripped of context. The people best able to explain the books were imprisoned, silenced, or dead. After that, later generations looked at the wreckage and imagined a single missing key. But perhaps the key was never missing. Perhaps there was no key because there was no single lock. The secret ledger was the order itself. Its routes, houses, books, seals, relationships, and disciplined habits of remembering. Its power came not from one document, but from continuity. Year after year, transaction after transaction, the order turned trust into written memory. That memory became valuable because people believed it. It became dangerous because it was believed by too many people, across too many borders, involving too much wealth and too many names. This also explains why the legend outlived the evidence. A single ledger can be found or lost. A system leaves traces everywhere, and certainty nowhere. One archive survives in part. Another disappears. A charter remains, but the account that explained it is gone. A receipt survives, but the political reason for the payment is forgotten. A royal debt is rumored, exaggerated, denied, or buried under later interpretation. The more fragmentary the evidence becomes, the more tempting it is to imagine that the truth was intentionally hidden. Sometimes it may have been. Often, it was simply broken. That distinction matters. Medieval archives did not need a conspiracy to become incomplete. Fire, war, neglect, legal transfer, changing ownership, bureaucratic confusion, and simple indifference could all damage the paper trail. Yet in the Templar case, the destruction of context was inseparable from political violence. The records did not merely age badly. They were caught inside a deliberate assault on the institution that created them. So what was lost? Not only paper, meaning. A ledger without its network becomes a list. A seal without its recognized authority becomes an artifact. A debt without its surrounding account becomes a rumor. Once the order was broken, its financial memory could no longer defend itself as a living system. Others could interpret it, exploit it, ignore it, or mythologize it. That is why the Templar ledger remains so haunting. It is not because we can prove the existence of one forbidden book. It is because we can see the outline of a system that must once have known far more than the surviving fragments can tell us. The real secret was not written in a magic alphabet. It was written in trust, and when trust was shattered, the words remained. But the world that made them readable was gone. Chapter 16. The Code that Outlived the Order. In 1312, the Knights Templar were formally dissolved. The order that had guarded pilgrims, held estates, managed deposits, moved credit, served rulers, and stood behind sealed promises was no longer allowed to exist as itself. Its surviving assets were largely redirected, its name damaged, its brothers scattered into prison, retirement, or other religious arrangements. The network did not vanish in one breath, but its authority was broken. And that is where the legend truly begins. A living institution can answer questions. It can open books, produce witnesses, explain procedures, correct misunderstandings, and defend the meaning of its own records. A destroyed institution cannot. Once the Templars were gone, their financial memory survived only in fragments, transfers, hostile paperwork, later discoveries, and stories told by people who no longer belonged to the system. The result was a silence that looked deliberate. People came to imagine hidden treasure because wealth had clearly existed. They imagined secret codes because records had become difficult to read. They imagined a single missing ledger because a scattered administrative world is hard to picture. They imagined the Templars as guardians of forbidden knowledge, because the ordinary truth had been buried under accusation, seizure, and time. But the most convincing answer is quieter. The real code was not an alphabet. It was trust. Trust in a seal, trust in a house, trust in a written order, trust that a deposit made in one place could matter somewhere else, trust that men sworn to personal poverty could guard other people's wealth better than many men who openly desired it, trust that records would remember what power preferred to forget. That code outlived the order because it was never only Templar. Medieval Europe continued moving toward credit, written finance, account systems, and institutions that could make value travel without always moving metal. The Templars did not invent that world alone, but they helped reveal how powerful it could become when faith, discipline, reputation, and administration worked together. Their fall also revealed the danger. A system built on trust can be shattered by force. Its books may remain, but the confidence that made them meaningful can die. A ledger can be seized. A treasury can be counted. A commandery can be reassigned. Yet the relationships behind those things are harder to preserve. Once broken, they leave behind not a clean answer, but a bruise in the record. That bruise became myth. The Templars were dissolved, but the idea of them escaped control. They became martyrs, villains, bankers, warriors, heretics, victims, symbols, warnings. Every age found a different Templar to suit its own fears. For some, they represented holy courage betrayed by politics. For others, secret power punished at last. For many, they became proof that somewhere beneath official history, another history must be waiting. Maybe that is why the secret ledger still haunts us. Not because we expect one book to appear and explain everything, but because we recognize the shape of the problem. Powerful institutions still know what others owe. Records still outlive reputations. Finance still creates invisible dependencies. And when archives are broken, the missing pieces often become louder than the surviving ones. So the final answer is not that the Templars left behind a magical cipher. It is that their world became unreadable when the network that gave it meaning was destroyed. The most haunting code was the silence after the seals were broken.